Be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. I think one of the more interesting kind of parts about baseball is kind of like hockey. It's really the only professional sport compared to basketball and football where like a level of fighting is like kind of allowed.
Right. And I just, the first thing I thought when you said that was Myles Garrett. Right. You know, you don't see that very often in football.
Even in football, you throw a punch in football, you're almost immediately ejected. If there was actually like a bench clearing incidents between teams, like I remember there was that, I think it was the Ravens Bengals or Steelers Bengals game where like the two teams almost fought because of dirty hits or something.
Right.
And like
exactly.
That was like a huge thing in baseball. It's like other than this year so far, like every year you're going to have two teams come out of the dugouts and like stand there, you know, aggressively posturing at one another. But sometimes they actually fight.
For those that don't know who Myles Garrett is, he actually used his helmet to beat on the backup quarterback when he played for the Browns and got suspended for the rest of the season. He was pounding. Who was the quarterback? Do you remember? I don't.
It was a number 8.
Yeah, it was a backup quarterback.
It was the backup quarterback for the Steelers that year.
In any event.
Mason.
Yes, Rudolph.
Very
good. Yeah. Excellent. So, but in baseball, you know, it's been going on for a long time that benches clear and brawls happen. Although, as we go back through history, I had a hard time finding written accounts, because there's not going to be much video accounts, from 1950 and earlier.
Which is weird, because you would think it would be there, because it's such a big moment, and like if you have a brawl in a game, the story of the game is the fact that there was a brawl.
So you know, we read about Ty Cobb and going in the stands and fighting with fans, and him being a dirty,
right. So,
you know,
which is why I'm
player.
thinking probably you don't have many stories from back then, because guys just settled stuff off the field.
Yeah, I'll see you under the stadium.
Yeah, Ty Cobb doesn't need to fight you during the game; he's just going to find you afterwards.
And maybe it's interesting now because that there's brawls, because there's so much at stake in terms of how much players get paid compared to what they got paid. If you get injured, right, you know, and in a fight, you know, on a field today, it can cost you a lot of money, whereas maybe not so much.
Yeah, and I think it also comes down to it's also a known part of the game. So as a player, you know you can kind of do that now. Like, if something happens that's severe enough and you're like, you know what, yeah, I want to start an incident over this, you kind of can.
And it all starts in baseball, right? Most of the time, I guess, with the pitcher.
Yeah, I would be hard pressed to think there are some, but there's not a lot of incidents that don't involve a ball thrown at a player.
Well, and here's a good one that comes to mind right away for Met fans. It always seems the Mets are involved in these things. So in 1973, Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, is on the Reds, and he slides hard into second base, breaking up a double play in a playoff game against Bud Harrelson and his Mets, and a brawl ensues because Bud Harrelson's a little guy, and Pete Rose, who was also known for running over Ray Fosse in the All-Star game, you know, just a hard-nosed player, and they didn't, and for the rest of their careers, you know, they kind of had a, you know, it was good for Harrelson to sort of, you know, stand up that way, because for him to fight anybody was, you know, at 150 pounds soaking wet, he wasn't going to win any fights.
Right, exactly, and it's also a thing of like not backing down, and I think that's what it's. Unfortunately, you get into a weird thing of like essentially permitting baseball brawls is like this weird form of like performative masculinity where like, let's all show how tough we are and we're not going to take disrespect.
But I think hockey's the same way,
right?
Right, because when guys square off in hockey, and, you know, the referees kind of stand aside and kind of let them go at it for a little bit of time. And there was a time they tried to take fighting out of the game, but realized that for the players and for the fans, it's probably
right. And I think you don't see fighting in basketball outside of the Malice at the Palace, because right, you don't have the full it's not the same type of full contact nature. You saw some brawls, like I remember the Knicks and the Heat got into it at one point, but it's much more unusual. I think baseball and hockey need it specifically. Baseball, because there is no contact except egregious contact when a ball hits a player or somebody runs into one another, which aren't normal parts of the game. Meanwhile, like in football, you hit people all the time, so you really don't need to have an extracurricular activity to work out that anger.
And here's the other thing about baseball fights, I think in particular, in terms of, you know, almost all of them, nobody really gets hurt. in a baseball fight.
No, most of the time they don't even really fight. Both teams just kind of come out of the dugout and stand there and like look,
roll on one another, maybe, you know.
Yeah, maybe there's some light shoving, but mostly they just kind of yell at each other. It's much more unusual when they actually fight one another.
Of course, sometimes, you know, things can go on the ground that shouldn't happen, like Don Zimmer and Pedro Martinez, you know.
I always felt
Don Zimmer's a coach and Pedro's a player, and somehow he squares off with Don Zimmer and throws this old man to the ground.
Which is why I never really felt bad for Pedro, because Zimmer went for it.
Absolutely, 100%.
So like, it wasn't like Pedro like.
What was I supposed to do?
Yeah, he kind of just like moved out of the way and like.
Pedro just got hammered in the press
and I
for
felt
throwing down the old man.
I felt kind of bad for Pedro then, because it was like, what was he supposed to do? Just let Don Zimmer hit him?
You threw Popeye to the ground. You can't do that. So
maybe he should have eaten some spinach.
So you know, and in baseball, they for some reason they call baseball brawls Donnybrooks.
I have never heard that.
You've never heard that? That's like it's an old term from Ireland expression about rowdiness, and I guess there was a town that was known for its rowdy fairs or whatnot. But I've never heard basketball called a Donnybrook or football. And this maybe
never heard anything called Donnybrook.
Never even heard anything. Oh, that's a great word. And you know there aren't too many, you know, Donnybrooks that, you know, were happening before 1960.
It's also a really dangerous name because one, it sounds like somebody's name, like old Donnybrook, or it sounds like some tiny river from Ireland.
Thinking Donnie Brasco, so that's something very different. And sometimes if you're the player and you gonna come out to the mound, right? You take an inside pitch or you get hit. You know, like Paul Wilson, former Met, he had quite the experience with Mr. Farnsworth.
He made a terrible mistake that day. So for anybody that doesn't know about this incident, this happened I think 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
So Farnsworth is pitching for the Cubs, and Pete Wilson, Paul Wilson was up at bat. Now Paul Wilson was the pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds at this time. So this is not like a position player. This is another pitcher. Mr. Farnsworth throws a baseball that's a little bit too inside for Paul Wilson. Doesn't hit him. Just too inside for Paul Wilson's liking. So Paul Wilson decides...
He thinks about it for a second.
He thinks about it. You can see him. If you go back and watch the replay, you can see him consider this course of action.
That's a pretty big dude out there.
Yeah, and I don't know why he decided to go through with it. So he decides to charge the mound. Now, there's a couple things you need to know about Kyle Farnsworth before Paul Wilson and him meet, about halfway between the mound and the home plate. One, Kyle Farnsworth about 6'3", 240.
He might be 6'4", yeah.
He was a black belt. He was also an all-state linebacker in high school for Illinois.
Now, Paul Wilson is not a little guy.
But Kyle Farnsworth just textbook form tackles Paul Wilson. Like, it was one of the best tackles.
Almost like a pile drive.
Just shoulder straight into the dude's gut, puts him on the ground, one punch to the face, brawls over. Like, it was just like, why would you have even done that? You're the pitcher.
and Farnsworth had other sort of, you know, run-ins, you know, right, he was known as this kind of a, you know, hot-tempered and don't mess with this guy because he'll come after you and he'll throw punches and whatnot. Another one that comes to mind, and we'll bounce around with a few of these, is another Met player, named Sean Estes. What do you remember about Sean?
I remember
Estes?
He was a Met.
So
he was a lefty?
He was very good. He came with the Giants and he played for the Mets. But
he was at near the end of his career when he got to the Mets. He wasn't like the pitcher he was with the Giants when he came over. He was never great before that
anyhow. But anyway, he in the 2000 World Series, if those of us that remember that, with Roger Clemens and Mike Piazza, the bat breaks and Clemens throws the bat at Piazza and calls it a ball, and so the Mets don't play the Yankees again. They lose that series until 2002, and the Yankees come to Shea Stadium still at that time.
Yeah, because that was like a year or two before
2002. No, it was 7 years before 2009 when City opened. And coming to the plate is Mr. Clemens because he has to bat in the National League part. And who's on the mound? Sean Estes. And so the crowd is just giving it, to Clemens and calling his name. And so what does Estes do? He tries to hit Clemens, but he misses him and he throws it behind him.
Now, here's the thing. Even if Estes have hit him, it wouldn't have been that good because I think Estes topped out in like 90 miles an hour to begin with at this point. So it wasn't like he was up there throwing seeds.
But he, I think to this day, he's now like renowned for trying to hit a guy and he missed it.
Weirdly, that happened again to the Mets because if you remember, Syndergaard got thrown out of the playoff game against the Dodgers for throwing behind the guy.
Right. Out of the game.
He threw behind the guy because he knew he had to throw at him, but he didn't want to hit him and get thrown out of the game, so he just threw behind him and the ump tossed him anyway.
So Bleacher Report went back and looked at a few memorable brawls. What surprises me is I guess you see benches clear, right? There's one thing to have benches clear.
There's a stark difference between a bench clearing incident and an actual
bench
brawl.
clears. Players are on the field, they're jawing at one another, but there's not necessarily anything really going on.
The animosity isn't.
That happens more often than I think any kind of
I would
real
say the
fight.
vast majority of any
benches clear,
are just bench clearing
and that's
incidents.
an ESPN story the next day. Oh, the Dodgers played the Padres last night, and there was a bench clearing, and then they went back to the dugout
a lot
and
of
played
it's
the game.
because there's so much stricter penalties to prevent things from like that escalating. If you get in an actual fight, there's a good chance you're going to be suspended for 5 to 10 games now.
I think
which costs you a lot of money.
That's a great point, because I think that but 30 years ago, so here in 1993, Musina, Hall of Famer, and Bill Hasselman, a catcher, charged the mound against Musina, and then ended up resulting in an 8-minute brawl. Randy Johnson, Jay Buhner, Tino Martinez,
all these classic
Omar
90s
Vizquel
players.
were just some of the names throwing punches in sub-skirmishes around the field. And Lou Piniella, basically gets ejected from the game. I'm not sure why Lou got thrown out for that. And he made sure that home plate was covered with a thin coat of dirt before he left the stadium.
And that is a very Lou Piniella thing to do.
But here's the thing. We talk about injuries. Mariners starter Chris Bosio, you might remember Chris Bosio.
I do not.
Okay, pitched for the Brewers, and the Mariners fractured his collarbone in the ball. So finally, here's a guy who gets hurt in an on-the-field brawl that cost him some time.
And I think that's also one of the difficulties of the brawl, and why you don't see them escalate a lot, is because I have to imagine that's also one of those things your contract probably has clauses against. Like, if you get hurt in a brawl on the field, as the team, and probably
definitely.
you're not going to be able to get paid then. Because,
Sort of like falling off a horse. We won't talk about that.
Yeah, we won't talk about that. We're playing pickup basketball.
and we talked about in our, I think baseball, it wasn't baseball oddballs, with the play between Marichal and Roseboro in 1965.
We didn't talk about that play. No. I think what we talked about is that, wasn't there a brawl that you had mentioned to me previously outside the show about like with Bill Lee?
Oh,
that was the Donnybrook thing. I thought I'd heard you mention that term before. Was there something with Bill Lee?
Maybe. I talked about Bill. So Johnny Roseboro was a catcher for the Dodgers, and Marichal is batting at the plate in a game against Koufax. And so Marichal thinks that Roseboro is throwing the ball too close to his ear as he throws it back to the pitcher. So all of a sudden, he thinks that Roseboro was intentionally trying to hit him, and so then there ends up being a fight, but Marichal decides to use his bat and hits Roseboro over the head with his bat.
Right, and that was a big deal because you never really saw, you never saw guys go after each other with equipment.
I don't think I've certainly never seen that. So Koufax, who's not a big guy, runs in. He's 6'2", but he's not a real heavy set guy.
He's a slight guy. Yeah.
Right. And they pry Marichal away from Roseboro, but after the catcher's standing there dripping with blood. I mean,
to me, the baseball brawl I always remember it wasn't even a major league brawl. It was a minor league one, because it was the only time I saw a player imply strategy with his brawling. So guy gets hit with a pitch. Little tiny dude gets hit with a pitch. What's the first thing he does? He's already made the decision to charge the mound. What do you think the first thing he does? Turns around and kicks the catcher over, then charges the mound.
That's actually a good idea.
Absolutely genius, because he knew in that incident. He's like, let
me take care of his protection.
Yeah, he just sticks his leg out, knocks the catchers over, and just sprints for the mound because he knows he's bought himself an extra couple seconds.
So I guess Yankee fans will remember. So we got to give a little equal time here. A-Rod. In a brawl in 2004, it began in the third inning. He was hit by Bronson Arroyo. And he starts.
That couldn't hurt that much.
What's that?
That couldn't hurt that much.
True story. He starts cursing at Arroyo, and then he decides to turn around and abuse Jason Varitek, the catcher. Not such a good idea. So a shoving match turns into punches, and a skirmish escalate into a full team-on-team brawl. Kevin Millar and Trot Nixon throw punches at Yankee starting pitcher Tanyan Sturz, which resulted in a bloodied ear. So we got another.
Yep.
And the dust settled, but there were no major injuries during the scuffle, and the Red Sox won that game 11-10. And mainly, so Alex isn't really fighting. He's just starting.
Alex has started I think that was even part of it. Is like he started that, and then you see like the photos of the brawl, and he's like completely on the other side of it. Like I didn't actually think this was going to go this far.
And how about 46-year-old Nolan Ryan and Robin Ventura?
Oof.
So
that's a bad look for a young Robin Ventura.
Right. So it's 1993, August 4th, and he hits Robin Ventura, and Ventura thinks about taking his base and looks at Ryan, and something snapped about 10 feet up the line, and so he runs at Ryan.
Didn't Nolan Ryan say something to him? I thought that was always a story, is Ryan said something to him.
He said, "Come out here," probably.
Or like take your base or something. Like don't slow walk on me.
Ventura runs at him hard, right? And somehow he ends up in Ryan headlocks him and is giving him the punches underneath.
Which props to Robert Ventura to coming back and having a good career after that, because that would sink a lot of players if you get like beaten up by your dad essentially on the field.
That's cold-blooded. And obviously one of those guys went on to have a Hall of Fame career. Robin Ventura fell a little short. We call him an almost guy.
Yeah, he's a Hall of Very good for sure.
So Armando Benitez, before he pitched for our Mets, he was on the Orioles, and he threw at Tino Martinez. And Tino Martinez was like one of those guys who got involved in skirmishes, if you will, all the time. And so in that particular fight, the Yankees came out the dugout after Martinez gets hit, and Darryl Strawberry is going blow to blow with 3 Orioles, and Joe Torre basically had to walk out in the field and escort Strawberry out to the locker room.
He was just going to keep going at that point.
Exactly. Strawberry was a guy who liked it. And so Strawberry played for those 1986 New York Mets, obviously, and that was known as a fighting team. So you don't really see that now, a team that had a reputation, because the Mets were arrogant. Obviously, they were very good, and they had lots of on-the-field fights.
I think baseball's gone out. They've definitely discouraged that type of thing. It's not a great look.
Right. And if you go back to before the Mets, and the Mets, the brawl in Mets, and teams love to play the Mets and love to fight with the Mets, and they like to do it too. By the way, the Mets did, they were going into clubs and causing incidents that season in Houston, and they were just that kind of a team. The Yankee teams of the late 70s and 77 and 78, they fought more amongst themselves than they did with the other team, with Billy Martin and Reggie Jackson and Munson.
But even then, when you hear about a lot of these brawls, what's interesting is that there are a lot of rivalry brawls. Teams having in-division rivalries definitely escalates the chance of there being a brawl because you play them so often.
Yeah, and don't you think right now the Dodgers and the Padres, what the series is 2-1 for the Padres right now, the game 4, this 4-game series this weekend, and that looks like it's heading towards something to me.
But now the thing is now, because with all the warning penalties and rules, now if you almost are better off just immediately going into the fight the first time something happens than letting it simmer for a few days, because now warnings have been handed out. Now Major League Baseball is paying attention. So if you have a fight on this 4th day, everybody's eating suspensions.
It's very different. You mentioned the Yankees. I mentioned the Yankees and the Oakland A's, which we talked about winning the championship 72, 73, and also a team that just did not get along with each other. So they were fighting. Reggie Jackson and Dick Williams was the manager.
Clearly, Reggie Jackson liked fighting.
I don't know.
I mean, he's involved with the 72 Rays and then the A's and then the late 70s Yankees. He's in a lot of the middle of that.
Yeah, well, he's just the kind of guy I think the straw that stirred the drink was the expression that they used about Reggie, or he used about himself when comparing him to Munson, because Munson was getting at that time sort of the accolades as the player driving the Yankees, and Reggie took umbrage to that. Mm-hmm. And obviously that one World Series game where he hit 3 home runs sort of put that to rest, at least for that particular time.
Correct.
So one of the nastiest brawls per Bleacher Report is in 1984, the Padres and the Braves. I don't remember this. I do remember that the Brave starter, Pascal Perez, not for this incident, for getting lost on the way to the stadium when he was pitching for the Braves. He was driving around the stadium. He couldn't find his way into the stadium. He was the starting pitcher.
That's unusual.
But the tension began in that game when Pascal Perez hit Alan Wiggins in the lower back, and then the Padres starter, Ed Whitson, attempts to hit Perez in his first trip to the plate, and Perez proceeds to run around with the bat to defend himself after the bench is cleared, but no punches were thrown. Then, in the 4th inning, Perez was thrown at it again. So Whitson and the manager, Dick Williams, manager of those 72, 3, and 4 Oakland A's.
Tells you probably a little bit permitted.
Okay. And they tried to hit Perez again in the 6th.
Yeah. At that point, you're going to get an incident.
He was unsuccessful, and he was ejected. Finally, in the 8th inning, this is the same game, Craig Lefferts drilled Perez in the elbow in a brawl, and so, that's enough. You got to do the guy 4 times.
You can't try and hit this guy 4 times.
Fans got involved. More players got ejected. And another hit batsman in the 9th inning, including Goose Gossage beating Donnie Moore, who was a pitcher.
So yeah, that sounds like a why. You don't see a lot of games like that, because now it's like you hit if a guy gets hit with a pitch and there's any kind of jawing about it, immediately the umpires warn both teams. So whatever pitcher hits the next guy is getting tossed.
Right. And like you said, they don't want that to happen. And I don't think the players want it to happen either. And now they have an excuse to not have it happen because you get suspended, you lose money, you hurt your team, if you're out of lineup for 5 or 6. But there comes a point where you feel, and you pitched, you have to defend your team.
Ironically, you know what's another reason why you might see less bench clearing incidents is you have to have a pitcher throw to 3 batters. So you can't literally just like bring in a guy for the express purpose of hitting somebody now.
There's an idea. How about a tactic, right?
Yeah, get
thrown out of the game for intentionally hitting a guy. You only got to pitch to 2 batters or 1 batter.
Yeah, you're just like, okay, yeah, he got the guy out. Okay, just hit him.
Oh, you've got a real strategic insight there. I think that's a little dangerous. So there are also some. You get more injured, right? Because we can't really find very many. Chris Bosio's broken collarbone, about the only thing we found that a real injury as a fight. But how about Cody Bellinger dislocating his shoulder on a high five?
Yeah, I mean, baseball is not exactly a full contact sport. It's probably a good thing considering guys can dislocate their shoulders just high fiving each other in the dugout.
And in 2016, Russell Martin, when he was on the Blue Jays, split his pinky after high fiving after a wild card win. So you get more
high fives are apparently they should just be high fiving each other out there in these brawls.
They're coming up with too many. So I think you're going to see, like I said, we know you're going to see less of it now for a lot of reasons. But once in a while, it kind of would be fun to see an old-fashioned Donnybrook.
Yeah. I think there's something classic about it. And I think that's why you just see so many bench clearing incidents, because teams can bench clear, yell at each other, and then just go back, and there's no really big deal about it.
I almost forgot to mention this, and this is a weird historical baseball event, and that is an off-the-field event between then Angels pitcher Chuck Finley and his ex-wife, Tawny Katane.
This was like a huge story. I remember it just being all over SportsCenter.
It is because of the way it was reported, right? And I think both of them, they're not married now, but they're still friends and whatnot, and they talk about this incident getting, it was way overblown.
Which because you just didn't hear one, because the initial reporting was unfortunately. A man got beaten up by a woman.
She kicked the crap out of her husband, who's a 6'4" baseball. She's this tiny little girl, and she beat him with her shoe or something like that.
And people at the time didn't realize, like, oh wait, that's possible.
and so Finley had to live with the people going, oh yeah, you let your. I mean, that's because there's a macho aspect to the sport,
right? And that's the problem, because so what was he supposed to do? Beat his wife up? Is that what like? So it's like, I understand it was a really toxic kind of story, and I'm kind of glad that
it's a good thing he wasn't right-handed. Apparently, she couldn't hit right-handers; she can only hit lefties.
And that's a really funny joke.
So
it's terrible, but it's funny.
It's terrible. So we'll look around and see if there's going to be anything. I would pick the Dodgers Padres as the biggest candidate for a brawl this season.
Without knowing anything else, I think they're the most likely ones at the moment. Though I could see the Astros getting involved with somebody at some point.
Well, and that's a great point to make, because they've already had their sort of big boo in Oakland, and
that in Oakland they're going on a full tour.
How about when
this
they
year?
Come and play the Yankees?
Yeah, it's gonna be bad.
Yeah.
Especially if they play the Yankees,
the Dodgers.
Especially if the Yankees are kind of keep sucking it up and they're not doing well by the time the Astros come to town and they don't have anything to lose.
Yeah, I don't really want to see Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, and Luke Voigt coming after me, actually.
yeah. I just say Yankees with nothing to lose would be about the scariest team in a baseball brawl.
We'll watch for that.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Cool.